Hello, listen to this episode and then go onto my Patreon, Greg Larson on Patreon, and give me money to make episodes like this and others and money. Mummy!
The Greg Larson Show! The big unit is ready to go! The Greg Larson Show! Muck around on the marzipan, a fresh custard in his hand. The greatest podcast in all the land. Greg Larson Show. Yeah. Great, just what we need, another podcast show.
Towards the end of the 20th century, on a small M-class planet known as Earth, a mid-tier technological civilization existed. Without getting bogged down in too many details, there were basically a bunch of primates that got pretty smart and decided to invent a whole bunch of stuff. Stuff like cheese, governments, action figures, totem tennis, and gas chambers. And these hairless monkeys, also known as people, lived in a whole bunch of places all around the planet. And in 1992, there were a lot of places. The biggest place on Earth was called Russia. The place with the most people was called China. And at this time, the most powerful place was called America. But there was another place that was hot and nice and a bit boring called Australia. And in Australia, there was one place in particular where this story starts. It's a place with the absolute best beaches in the world and the absolute worst people. The Sunshine Coast. And it was here in 1992 that a baby slid out of his mother's bleeding vagina whilst they both screamed. That baby was called Jackson. And he was just the worst cunt alive. To be fair, Jackson never had much of a chance. He was never not going to be the worst cunt. His father worked in finance, his mother was a real estate agent who also ran the PTA, and she had a lifelong secret desire to fuck her son. And he grew up an only child in the Sunshine Coast. He went to a school only for boys, he had a house with a rumpus room, and he refused to eat vegetables, which his mum obliged because she would do anything for her son, including look at his little dick and smile when he slept as a baby. His brain didn't have to become cooked, though. If he had grown up in a different time or a different place, he might have been a different person. But for Jackson, there wasn't much hope. The year 2010 is when his marinated brain really began to cook. He had just become an adult, he had unfiltered access to the internet, he had money and income from working at JB Hi-Fi, and he was about to become wealthy by purchasing Bitcoin because Jackson was online a lot. Prior to 2010, Jackson was definitely a cunt, but just a dumb cunt. Not a hateful dumb cunt, just a regular sunny coast dumb cunt. He would graffiti trains with his tag IEP, which stood for I Eat Pussy. He would tip over all the bins on bin night, and if he ever passed a children's playground at night, he and his friends would never fail to piss all over the slides. There were only 2 cops in his neighbourhood, so his antics never got him in trouble, but even if they had, it would have been a boys will be boys situation. A slap on the wrist. But Jackson was not political, not part of any cause or belief system, and had he lived just a few decades earlier, he would have straightened out and got a job where his dad worked and spent the remainder of his life working, watching the footy on weekends and not really hurting anyone except his immediate family. Not that he would have physically assaulted or abused his hypothetical wife or kids, just that being around him would have hurt their souls. Or to give an even more optimistic outlook, if it was a few decades earlier, maybe Jackson could have grown up and matured, realised that eating a vegetable once in a while is okay, and that his mum and dad were kind of fuckwits. He might have been all right. But again, this wasn't a few decades earlier. This was 2010, and unfortunately, Jackson had internet access. It was a Tumblr page that first radicalised Jackson. He saw a Tumblr blog made by a 16-year-old British girl in which she had made a collage of photos of men doing what she referred to as man-spreading on public transport, sitting there with their legs spread out wide. And Jackson went into a rabbit hole, following Tumblr blog after Tumblr blog of people posting and commenting on this man-spreading phenomenon. Anonymous teenagers halfway around the world were annoyed at men for spreading their legs on a train, and Jackson was furious. This is bullshit, thought Jackson. I don't do this. Most men don't do this. Some men do, some women do. I've seen so many women riding the train with their bags on the seat so no one sits next to them. Jackson had a lot of thoughts on this topic, and the thing is, not all of these thoughts were wrong or bad. None of these posters on talking about man-spreading on Tumblr had done any kind of exhaustive study to find out how many men engage in this behaviour, or any study to find out if women also engage in similar behaviour. None of them had cited any academic sources to demonstrate how widespread this man-spreading thing was. Was this a real problem? Or was it confirmation bias? Was this actually happening? Or was it a made-up moral panic? But what Jackson didn't stop to think about was that he was on the internet, where anyone can post anything and nothing is fact-checked. He didn't stop to wonder if any of these posters were adults or children or bots in Russia. He didn't wonder as to whether real people felt like this or if this was just a small trend on a small corner of the internet. As far as he was concerned, these were real mainstream opinions, and he felt, without any evidence of his own, mind you, that those opinions were poorly researched and poorly thought through. And rather than thinking these thoughts, just thinking, well, that's an opinion I disagree with, and going about his day, Jackson did the absolute worst thing that a human being could ever do in their lifetimes. He posted a comment on the internet. On one of these man-spreading posts, he wrote a comment that said, "What about women who intentionally leave their bag on the seat to block it off for others?" And that was all it took. From that moment on, from that one simple comment, Jackson's life, and by extension, all of humanity, was doomed. You see, it wasn't the echo chamber of people parroting his own opinions back to him that first made Jackson insane. It was the people whose opinions he disagreed with who called him a tosser. They got online and they called him a tosser, a wanker, a neckbeard, a fuckboy. These 16-year-old girls from halfway around the world just kept piling on, and Jackson fought back in the great war of his time, the second last war in the history of planet Earth, the culture war. Jackson started posting on 4chan and in anti-Tumblr Reddits. Instead of not looking at his computer and swimming at the beach where literally no one is talking about how the Scooby-Doo spin-off Velma was needlessly woke, Jackson continued to gobble up the rotten green pus of social media. He was blind to anything else, even as the lives of those around him got worse. By 2024, Jackson was convinced that wokeness was the cause of all the world's problems. He never used to hate gay or transgender people. If you'd asked him even 6 years ago before the pandemic, he would have had no problem with anyone using any bathroom they liked. He wouldn't have cared. He wouldn't have even had opinions about drag queens or trans people or anyone fucking anyone else. Despite his leanings, back in 2017, he voted yes for marriage equality, because even back then, people of his generation didn't give a fuck about whether two dicks or two pussies or whatever genitals mashed up against whatever genitals. But this was 2024, and Jackson's hatred of all things woke had manifested to the point that whatever the left was in favour of, he was against. So, if transgender rights was something the dirty, commie, ex-Tumblr, university, purple-haired, lip-ring crowd cared about, he was against it. He couldn't stand that choice of pronouns was now in the menu screen for a video game that he liked. It made him physically nauseous when a comic book movie had a black character, and he bemoaned the disappearance of real men from our society, conveniently forgetting that his dad, that he admired so much as a real man, was just a soft, pudgy office boy, and Jackson had never experienced life without aircon. It didn't help that no politicians, or really anyone on the so-called left, made even the slightest attempt to win Jackson over. He was the straight white man that stood in the way of progress. And again, the only time he ever interacted with these people was in anonymous social media posts in which they called him a Nazi. And politicians in the so-called centre were not much better. They just spoke in monotone voices and kept saying things like working families over and over again, while people stood behind them and smugly nodded. It was for this reason that Jackson became one of the worst things that a human being can be. He became an Australian Trump supporter. Trump, the literal pants-shitting billionaire rapist and suspected pedophile from America, who was running for a second term as American president. And despite being a rapist and a billionaire and probably a pedophile, Jackson liked him because the bar in politics was so low that simply talking in a normal voice and calling your opponent an idiot and saying they should go to jail was a cathartic release. It was unlike anything he'd ever heard. Plus, Trump was running against a brown woman who, despite being a big fan of bombing and deporting other brown people, was somehow a woke Marxist in Jackson's eyes, because she was brown and a woman. Jackson's whole community was falling apart, specifically because of people like Trump and Trump's running mate, Elon Musk. The Sunshine Coast, once a place that was habitable by the middle and sometimes even working class families, was now a wasteland of ultra-wealthy holiday rentals. Most of the people Jackson went to school with, despite coming from families with decent incomes, were now completely priced out of their own neighbourhoods. Cost of living was going up everywhere because rich billionaires were taking record profits as productivity skyrocketed, yet wages stagnated. The billionaire leeches were draining humans of their lifeblood, yet Jackson's favourite people were billionaire leeches. Even Jackson himself, doing well with his Bitcoin and his trust fund, was still worse off than his parents. And even with all the money he had, he would never come close to being able to afford a house at the Sunshine Coast without his parents. There were no more good fruit and veg shops near him. They all went out of business because they couldn't afford the rent. Just the big chains of Coles and Woolworths with their overpriced bland shit. He lived on the coast, but most of the seafood on offer was frozen from Vietnam because the local area had been overfished and it was cheaper to import. He didn't know it at the time, but Jackson was infertile because he had microplastic in his testicles and not enough sperm. In fact, like most humans at the time, his internal organs were riddled with microplastics, and that even caused a polyp to form in his colon, which would have developed to cancer and killed him at the age of 50 if he had lived that long. But he genuinely didn't believe microplastics actually existed, because he had once heard a left-wing person say they do, and Jackson's opinions were now entirely reactionary. If a lefty had told him not to eat his own shit, he would be gulping it down within a millisecond. Overall, things were terrible for his community, his friends, his whole generation, and he was on track to die young. But for him and his friends and everyone in his circle, they all agreed. None of that mattered. None of it mattered because people are putting he, him, and she, her at the bottom of their emails. That was the real enemy. Jackson loved Trump, an Australian Trump supporter. He donated money to the Donald Trump campaign because he didn't understand how elections work, and his anti-wokeness had cooked his brain so much that he could no longer distinguish the country of America from the country of Australia. To him, there were only two countries, woke and anti-woke. And he would give his life for the nation of anti-woke. He bought as many Trump coins as he could, unaware or uncaring that it was a pyramid scheme. He donated directly to the Trump campaign. He spent hundreds of hours online debating leftists, and he even drove around with a Trump flag on his car in Australia. And he thought that was normal. So Jackson cheered when the Elon Musk / Donald Trump team were elected in America. He loved to wave an Aussie flag to piss off the lefties on Australia Day, but he would happily burn that flag and betray his country if it meant fucking over the lefty cuck soy boys. He was also delighted to see Peter Dutton, or as history knows him, Pedo Pete, praise and even model his own political career on Trump. But he couldn't wait to vote for Pedo Pete because fuck woke, because fuck you cunt. And so it was in 2025, after Trump took over, that Jackson was orgasming daily at the images of videos of lefties crying on social media. He cheered with delight as Elon Musk stole Americans' social security information. He squealed like a piggy when Pedo Pete praised Trump as a big thinker and deal maker. He rolled around the floor, kicking and pissing and cumming and shitting all over himself as he watched people being released from jail who had bashed a cop to death on the 6th of January, 2021. Jackson had never felt more alive. And when Trump announced in no uncertain terms that he was going to clean out Gaza and eliminate the Palestinian population, Jackson was overcome with joy. He had no love for Israel. He couldn't locate Israel on a map. He didn't know anything about Jewish people except that a few of his friends said they controlled the media. And to be frank, had Jackson been alive in Nazi Germany, he probably would have run a gas chamber. But because Trump and Pedo Pete supported Israel, so did he. Jackson didn't know who or what a Palestinian was, but he saw their flags at a lefty protest, so he knew for certain they had to be wiped out. It was a year before the start of World War III. America had just put boots on the ground in Gaza, and the genocide there was kicking into full gear. The news media and so-called rational centrists were very busy making sure people understood that the situation in the Middle East was complicated and that there needs to be calm from both sides. People on the left were busy arguing amongst themselves in leftist subreddits and on social media about whether structural change needs to include the discourse of intersectional post-colonial voices. Zionists in Israel were chanting in the streets, "Death to Arabs, we will burn your villages," as they destroyed food and water supplies to the Gaza Strip whilst their military bombed children's hospitals to rubble. And the conservatives of America, Australia, Britain and everywhere in the West were lining up to get a new kind of surgery called cockmouth surgery, in which people would have their spine broken and then be folded in half and have their tiny boy cocks stitched permanently onto their lips so they could directly drink the oceans of black cum that flowed continuously into their mouths as lefties around the world had meltdowns on social media. When the war in Gaza was expanded and Israel invaded Lebanon, Syria and Jordan and began the ethnic cleansing in those areas to fulfill the long-term goal of the creation of the state of Greater Israel, no one in the West even cared. This was old news now. We were bored of it, and the culture war was still raging. Conservatives were upset about the new Indiana Jones reboot, Indiana Jones and the Soggy Cunt, because it featured a character in a wheelchair, and by 2025, wheelchairs had been deemed woke. Trump had finally fulfilled his dream of shooting a baby live on television, and his supporters simply called it fake news. They didn't believe it was real. And even if it was a 5D chess negotiating tactic to lower taxes. The traditional media went pretty soft and said that Trump had made a gesture consistent with baby death on television, whilst lefties wrote some mic drop opinion pieces online. But either way, Trump straight up got away with it. In 2026, most of the American population had either been shot, starved, or had their cocks sewn to their mouths and were housebound. Elon Musk had become the first trillionaire on Earth by selling jars of his piss for $20 a pop. And Australia, under the new Prime Minister Pedo Pete, was in the middle of the biggest housing bubble the world had ever seen. 2 single men owned all the houses in Australia. One was Pedo Pete, and the other was a Chinese businessman who had funded Pedo Pete's election the previous year. There was a widespread war now in the Middle East. Ukraine had been conquered and Russia had now invaded 2 NATO countries with America's blessing. But Jackson didn't even see that mentioned on the news or social media because there was a new video game out that featured a transgender goblin. And Jackson was too busy with his daily YouTube vlog where he mumbled with his own dick in his mouth about how the woke brigade needs to have the fight taken to them so no more kids can be exposed to any kind of transgender goblin, elf, or even cave troll. And so it was one evening on the Sunshine Coast. Jackson was lying on his floor. The Joe Rogan podcast was playing at 2 times speed, as Joe Rogan interviewed a man who thought that Garfield had built the pyramids. Jackson was using an eyedropper to squirt little drips of Daddy Elong's piss into the corner of his eyes. Because his mouth was sewn to his boy dick, this was the only way he could absorb the nutrients. It was then that Jackson heard the explosion. At first he thought it must have come from the TV, as he was also watching a stream from a furry gamer called Sigma Pup who was playing Call of Duty Black Ops 13. But no, this was louder. A real explosion outside. And then another. And then another. He would never find out where the missiles had come from. They could have been Russian, Chinese, North Korean, maybe even American, because Pedo Pete previously had the gall to say that Trump's idea to chlorinate the Pacific Ocean to get rid of all the fish was a little far-fetched. In retaliation, Trump had threatened to bomb Australia, which, despite the fact that he had in fact bombed Canada a month before, no one in the Australian media seemed to actually believe. In any case, Australia was being bombed, or hit with missiles, or something. Everywhere around the world was being bombed or hit with missiles. It was World War III. Jackson didn't know who was doing it, but he could see his mum run into the room screaming. He saw her for a split second. He saw her face melt before his eyes. He himself was 0.0003 seconds away from being vaporized. But in that slight fraction of a moment, time slowed down. In that moment, he was sure of 3 things. 1, there was no way that he was actually going to die. Trump and Pedo Pete and Daddy Elon would never, ever let that happen. They would rescue him somehow. They were the only ones who could stop this, and they definitely would. 2, the missiles were being fired by leftists or Muslims. It's always leftists or Muslims. Always. Not one fibre of his being doubted that. And 3, the only reason that this happened was because whoever was responsible for making sure missiles didn't hit us was too busy trying to type out their pronouns in an email. That's it. He knew it for sure. He was certain of it. There's a guy who sits in a tower and his one job is to look for missiles and then email the army and say, hey, there's a missile coming. But thanks to the loony left and the extreme greens, this guy had to waste valuable seconds typing he/him and sent from Gadigal land at the end of his email. That's the one and only reason these leftist missiles hit, thought Jackson. It's because leftist woke policies had created needless bureaucracy. These fucking lefty cucks, he thought. I was right. I was right the whole time. And that was the last thought he had. The last thing he thought, the last thing he knew was that he was right the whole time. Leftists have literally destroyed the earth with wokeness, and that thought made him so happy. So happy was he in the knowledge that he was right, that he shot a river of rotten cum into his own mouth, right as the fireball hit. And as he swallowed that cum, his head popped open like a raspberry in the hot Queensland summer sun. And the war on woke was over. The culture wars were over. World War III was over. And everyone on earth was dead. And there were no more opinions about anything. And 2,000 years later is when we, the mighty Gorlon race, took over the galaxy and got rid of all politics, all war, and made it illegal to not have a stiffy 24/7. Long live the glorious Gorlon Empire. Long live Emperor Goblob. That was the twist. The twist in the story was that this was being written by an alien in space. Suck my dick.
The Greg Larson Show. The big unit is ready to go. The Greg Larson Show. Muck around on the Mazapan. A fresh custard in his